I am going to completely change the kind of conversation we're having in this conference by talking about criminality and criminology. Because if there is one thing that defines criminology well, it's an inherent skepticism for the law, for legal practitioners, and for legal documents. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to consider housing from the perspective of a criminologist now. I'm going to rely on a criminological theory, and I'm going to apply this theory to some legal texts, and in a couple different settings. And so first, the theory. The theory has to do with the penal state that has been arising in the United States and Europe since the 1970s. And in general, in criminology, we consider that the crisis of the social state, especially in Europe, has led to the state pulling out of economic affairs and social affairs. And at the same time, the state has increased its presence in penal affairs. So this is a quote from a professor of mine at the Université Libre in Brussels, and his name is Philippe Marie, and he talks about the securitization of the social sphere. And so what he's saying in this quotation is that in a social penal state like the one we have today in Europe and in the United States, condemnations, so penal condemnations in courts, are no longer based on the infraction that has been committed or the personality of the offender, but based on the risk that a potential offender poses to the social penal state. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you exactly how this kind of thinking gets applied through the penal state and how it arrives in the social sphere. And then I'm going to take up an issue that is elaborated by a scholar named Louis Vacon. And Louis Vacon's theory is that the United States is the originator of a lot of these penal policies, these social penal policies, and that they migrate from the United States to England and then to the rest of Europe. So we'll take that up next. But to begin, to put some meat on the theoretical skeleton, I'm going to tell you about a situation that I encountered in Seattle as a researcher there. So, Seattle in 1997 created an ordinance which allowed police officers to issue exclusions to people who violate rules in parks, in buses, in libraries, in community centers. You'll see this picture here on the right side of the screen is a copy of a parks exclusion. And essentially what's happened in this case is a man has been found to be drinking in Prefontaine Park. And Prefontaine Park, sorry, I'll show you with the mouse, is right here. And so a police officer has witnessed this occur, and the police officer has decided to give this man a ban for 7 days. And the ban is not only in effect for Prefontaine Park, but it's applicable for all the parks in South Downtown Seattle. If this man returns to a park within the 7-day period during which he is banned, he is then guilty of first-degree trespass and will be taken to jail, if the police officer decides. This is a process of criminalization. His initial behavior, however, is not being criminalized. He's simply violated a rule. And as his behavior becomes worse in the eyes of the state's reaction becomes more severe. So initially, he's simply banned. Initially, he was only drinking in a park. If he returns to the park, he's then violating his ban, and he's become a criminal. So let me tell you about George. It's not his real name. But I met George when I was working in Seattle. George had been excluded. He had received a ban for sleeping in Freeway Park in Seattle. And that's the picture on the right. George returned to the park because that's where he lives. And when he returned to the park, a police officer arrested him and took him to jail. I met George when he was applying for social housing. And George showed me and the attorney that I was working with a letter he had received from the Social Housing Authority, which said that they could not provide him with housing assistance because he had been arrested for criminal trespassing. So our intervention was to attempt to explain that the only reason that George had been arrested for criminal trespassing was because he had no home. And if he had a home, he would not be a criminal. But the Social Housing Authority had just denied George access to a home. But you can see how, in the state's evaluation of George as a risk factor, George became more and more of a risk until his risk assessment affected his social decisions. And in this case, his social decision was to try and find subsidized housing. So again, think about this in terms of risk. According to the city, camping in a public park poses a risk. And in Seattle's discourse about public camping, camping in park poses hygienic threats to a park, it increases criminal behavior in a park, and it's unsightly. These are all pictures, that I took while I was working in Seattle. When the police officer sees George camping in the park, he's immediately assessed as a risk, and the police then provide him with an exclusionary order saying that he must leave the park because they're trying to neutralize him as a risk. When George returns to the park, he's not only someone who has bad behavior, but he's also someone who violates his municipal orders. So again, in the eyes of the city, George's risk factor has increased because he behaves badly and he defies municipal orders. And as a result, the state's response to George increases in penalty. He's first issued only an exclusion order, which is a municipal order. It's like a parking ticket. And when he violates the exclusion order, the state charges George with a crime. And again, it eventually ends up in the housing sector when George applies for social housing. And so again, you can see how this risk assessment invades the social sphere. So these are two quotations that I have taken from social housing authorities in Seattle. The Seattle Housing Authority is responsible for 26,000 residents. And you can see any crimes that indicate habitual criminal behavior will be a reason for the Seattle Housing Authority to deny assistance. Low Income Housing Institute is responsible for 1,700 properties. Again, we find the same language about criminals not being accepted into social housing. But again, through the process of criminalization that I was explaining, we can see how criminals may not pose an inherent risk to these social institutions. And we can ask, furthermore, who is being put at risk? Is George not becoming more socially precarious because of the state's response to him? Or are these housing authorities being put at risk for potentially housing someone that the state has called a criminal? But everyone knows that the United States is obsessed with security and penality. I don't think anyone, maybe you are surprised that this is occurring in the United States, but I think that it's easy for you to kind of integrate what I'm saying into your general conception of the United States. But it's not only in the United States that this is happening. So first we're going to look at the housing situation in England along these same lines, and then we're going to look at the housing situation in Belgium. So first in the United Kingdom, in 1998, 1 year after Seattle created its Parks Exclusion Ordinance, in the law and, the Crime and Disorder Act, the United Kingdom created antisocial behavioral orders. And they're not identical to a parks exclusion order, but they're similar. They're non-criminal ordinances that are designed to neutralize risky behavior that individuals demonstrate by drinking in public, by camping in public, by urinating in public. So we can see the same process of the neutralization of risk and the criminalization of risky elements in society through these antisocial behavioral orders. The orders were created in 1998. In 2003, the Antisocial Behavior Act allowed social landlord tenants to evict tenants who had been issued an antisocial behavioral order for behavior that they demonstrate. In 2003, the Antisocial Behavior Act gave landlords the power to evict tenants who were engaging in antisocial behavior and had received an antisocial behavioral order. In 2004, the severity of the state's response increased again. In 2004, social landlords had the right to deny people housing if it was clear that the person had received in the past an antisocial behavioral order for behavior associated with housing. So I'm not going to give you a kind of 5%er explanation about how these policies are migrating, but this is something that we need to take into account the way that these policies are moving overseas. So this man in this picture is William Bratton. He was responsible in New York for implementing the city's zero-tolerance police policies in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Zero-tolerance police policies is not the same thing as exclusionary orders in Seattle, but the thinking is the same, that we need to stop behavior immediately at its source before it becomes more dangerous. In 1999, William Bratton was hired by the Los Angeles Police Department to implement zero-tolerance policing in Los Angeles. In August 2001, last summer, after the London riots, William Bratton was hired by the City of London to consult with the city on how to implement zero-tolerance police policies there. This quote was from the New York Times, taken from the 12th of August 2001. Grant Shapps, the housing minister in England, stated on August 11th, 2001, that social landlords needed more power to evict tenants who engaged in antisocial behavior that was not directly linked to their tenant housing. Essentially, Grant Shapps was trying to give power to social landlords to evict tenants who had been issued antisocial behavioral orders for participating in the London riots. So again, I don't think it's coincidence that William Bratton arrived in London at the same time that the housing minister was making these kinds of statements. But I'm not suggesting collusion either. I just want you to be aware of the fact that we consider these policies to be deterritorialized. We don't think that the policies are responding to a specific situation in Seattle, in New York, in Los Angeles, or London. We think that these kinds of security policies can be implemented anywhere. So, with that in mind, we go to Brussels. Because if we want to see if this kind of security thesis holds, we can follow it spreading through the European continent. So Brussels in 2004 adopted a Code de Logement, and the Code de Logement included règles d'attribution, which are the rules which define how social landlords are allowed to decide which candidates receive and do not receive social housing. So here are the 6 standards that are outlined in the Code de Logement, which the landlords use to define whether or not an applicant is going to be receiving subsidies. The applicant cannot be a landowner or a landlord. The applicant cannot be already aided by another social CPAS. The tenant cannot be fautif. It's not defined exactly what fautif means. In most cases, it would be that the tenant has not paid rent on another social housing tenancy. The candidate must meet certain income restrictions, and the housing applied for must meet the housing needs of the tenant. But you notice there's no mention of a security threat in any of these laws. And I spoke with the director of the Foyer d'Ixelles. This is the social housing provider in Ixelles, the commune where I live in Brussels. And the director told me, in no uncertain terms, that criminal history or the presence of municipal orders on someone's record will never be used as a condition to determine whether or not a person is given social housing. So we can see that there's some kind of resistance existing in Brussels to a security type thinking that's invaded the United States and England. But again, if we want to understand how these policies are moving, Brussels can become a case. And we also know that since 1999, Brussels has been using administrative sanctions to punish antisocial behavior. So in conclusion, if anyone's looking to flex their criminological muscles a little bit, we can pay attention to what's happening in Brussels and what's going to happen with these administrative sanctions in the housing market and in the social housing market. Thank you so much.